What happens when one of the world's most beloved football legends sits down for what should be a routine talk show appearance, only to find himself facing a host determined to tear him down? You won't believe what unfolds when David Beckham's patience finally snaps after enduring relentless provocations that cross every line of professional decency. Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live became an absolute battleground that left viewers stunned and social media exploding with outrage. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when Hollywood's most controversial host pushes one of sport's biggest icons too far. The tension was palpable from the moment David Beckham walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage. What should have been a celebration of Beckham's latest business ventures and his continued influence in American soccer quickly transformed into something far more sinister. Kimmel, notorious for his sharp tongue and willingness to push boundaries, seemed determined to make this interview memorable for all the wrong reasons. The evening started innocuously enough, with Beckham looking relaxed in his perfectly tailored navy suit, flashing that trademark smile that has charmed millions worldwide. The audience erupted in their usual enthusiastic applause, clearly thrilled to see the Manchester United legend in person. But experienced viewers of Kimmel's show might have noticed something different in the host's demeanor, a particular gleam in his eye that suggested tonight would be anything but ordinary. "David Beckham, everybody," Kimmel announced with his characteristic theatrical flair. But there was an undertone that seasoned talk show watchers would recognize as dangerous territory. As Beckham settled into the guest chair, adjusting his posture with the confidence of someone who had done thousands of interviews, Kimmel wasted no time diving into what would become an increasingly uncomfortable conversation. The first red flag came disguised as casual banter. "So, David, I have to ask," Kimmel began, leaning forward with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "when you moved to America, did you have to take classes to learn how to actually kick a ball properly? Or did they just let you slide by? On that whole British charm thing?" The audience laughed, but there was an awkward pause as Beckham's smile faltered slightly. It was a jab masquerading as a joke, but the underlying disrespect was unmistakable. Beckham, ever the professional, responded with grace. "Well, Jimmy, I think my record speaks for itself. Manchester United, Real Madrid, the England national team. We seem to manage just fine with our British style of football." His voice remained steady, but viewers could see the slight tightening around his eyes. This was a man who had faced hostile crowds in stadiums around the world, but something about Kimmel's approach felt different, more personal, more calculated. Right, Kimmel continued, his tone becoming increasingly condescending. "But let's be honest here, David. When you came to LA Galaxy, wasn't that basically a retirement tour? I mean, Major League Soccer back then was pretty much where European players went to collect easy paychecks before hanging up their boots for good, wasn't it?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the audience's laughter became noticeably more forced and uncomfortable. Beckham's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I came to MLS to help grow the game in America, Jimmy. And I think if you look at where American soccer is now compared to where it was 15 years ago, you might see that it worked." There was steel in his voice now, a warning that anyone familiar with competitive athletes would recognize. But Kimmel seemed either oblivious to the danger signs or, more likely, determined to ignore them. The host's next move was particularly cruel, targeting not just Beckham's career but his personal life in a way that crossed every boundary of professional interview conduct. "Speaking of growing things, David, I've always wondered, when you're married to a Spice Girl, do you ever feel like you're just the sidekick in your own life story? I mean, Victoria's got her fashion empire, her celebrity status, and let's face it, she was famous long before most Americans even knew who you were." The studio fell silent. This wasn't playful ribbing between host and guest. This was character assassination disguised as entertainment. Beckham's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, slowly clenched into fists. His breathing became more measured, more controlled, the way it might before taking a crucial penalty kick. The camera caught every micro-expression, every sign that the legendary footballer's legendary composure was beginning to crack under Kimmel's relentless assault. "Victoria and I have built a successful partnership in every aspect of our lives," Beckham replied, his British accent becoming more pronounced as his anger simmered just beneath the surface. "We support each other's careers and achievements. I'm proud of everything she's accomplished, just as she's proud of mine." But Kimmel wasn't finished. He had tasted blood in the water, and like a shark, he was prepared to circle in for the kill. What happened next would become the moment that defined not just this interview, but potentially Kimmel's entire career. As a talk show host, as the comedian prepared to deliver a blow so personal and devastating that it would finally push David Beckham beyond his breaking point. The studio lights seemed to dim as Kimmel leaned back in his chair with the satisfied smirk of someone who knew exactly what he was about to unleash. "You know, David, I've been doing some research for tonight's show," he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "And I came across some interesting commentary about your kids' soccer careers. Apparently there are some people saying that maybe the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Or in this case, maybe it falls pretty far from the tree, if you know what I mean." The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even they could sense that something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere of the studio. This wasn't comedy anymore. This was cruelty, and everyone present could feel it. Beckham's face went completely still, his eyes narrowing as he processed what Kimmel had just insinuated about his children. "Excuse me?" Beckham's voice was dangerously quiet, each word precisely enunciated in a way that made seasoned reporters in the audience reach for their phones to start recording. This was the voice of a man who had captained England through some of their most pressurized moments, and it carried the weight of barely contained fury. But Kimmel, either high on his own perceived cleverness or completely misreading the room, doubled down on his attack. "Oh, come on, David, don't be so sensitive. I'm just saying that maybe your boys inherited more of Victoria's coordination than yours. I mean, have you seen her trying to kick a ball in those documentaries? It's like watching a newborn giraffe, trying to figure out how legs work." The camera captured every second of what happened next. Beckham's hands slowly unclenched, but not in a gesture of relaxation. This was the controlled movement of someone who was channeling years of athletic discipline to prevent himself from doing something he might regret. His breathing became visible, his chest rising and falling as he stared directly into Kimmel's eyes with an intensity that made the host's smug expression begin to waver. "Jimmy," Beckham said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in locker rooms filled with world-class athletes, "I've sat here and listened to you insult my career, my marriage, and now my children. But let me make something very clear to you." He leaned forward, and suddenly the power dynamic in the room shifted completely. "My children are off limits. Completely off limits. Do you understand me?" For the first time since the interview began, Kimmel looked genuinely unsettled. The audience was dead silent, hanging on every word. Even the camera operators seemed to sense they were witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television history. But instead of backing down, instead of offering an apology or changing course, Kimmel made the fatal mistake of trying to regain control through even more aggressive provocation. "Whoa, whoa, David, relax," Kimmel said, raising his hands, in mock surrender while maintaining that insufferable smirk. "I'm just having a little fun here. This is comedy, remember? Maybe British humor is different. But over here in America, we can actually take a joke without getting our designer underwear in a twist." The insult about British humor versus American humor was the spark that ignited a powder keg that had been building throughout the entire interview. Beckham's eyes flashed with a fury that millions of opposing players had seen right before he destroyed their defensive strategies with surgical precision. "You think this is funny?" he asked, his voice rising for the first time. You think attacking someone's family is comedy? Kimmel, perhaps realizing he had gone too far, but unable to find a graceful way out, committed to his destructive path. Look, if you can't handle a little ribbing, maybe you should have stayed in England where everyone thinks you walk on water. This is American television, buddy. We don't do the whole bowing and scraping thing here. The condescension in Kimmel's voice was the final straw. Beckham stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the silent studio like a gunshot. At 6 feet tall, with the bearing of someone who had performed under pressure in front of hundreds of millions of viewers, he suddenly seemed to tower over the seated talk show host. The cameras captured every angle as one of the world's most respected athletes prepared to deliver a response that would define this moment forever. "You know what, Jimmy?" Beckham's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I've played in front of hostile crowds. I've dealt with tabloid journalists. I've faced criticism from people who actually matter in this world. But what you're doing right now, this isn't comedy. This isn't entertainment. This is just a sad little man trying to make himself feel important by tearing down someone else." The studio audience was completely transfixed. Social media was already exploding as clips of the confrontation spread across every platform. But Kimmel, backed into a corner and with his reputation on the line, was about to make one final catastrophic mistake that would turn this heated exchange into an absolute war. What came out of Kimmel's mouth next would haunt his career for years to come. Standing up from his own chair in a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of authority, he pointed directly at Beckham and delivered the words that would seal his fate. "You know what, David? Maybe if you spent less time posing for underwear, ads and more time actually being a father, your kids wouldn't need you to defend them on television. But hey, at least they'll always have those modeling contracts to fall back on when the soccer thing doesn't work out, right?" The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of absolute vacuum of sound that occurs when an entire room collectively holds its breath, realizing they've just witnessed something that can never be taken back. The audience sat frozen, many with their hands covering their mouths in shock. Even the camera operators seemed paralyzed by the magnitude of what they had just recorded. Beckham's face went through a transformation that was terrifying to witness. The controlled anger, the measured responses, the professional composure, all of it evaporated in an instant. His face flushed red, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables, and his eyes blazed with a fury that made it clear that Jimmy Kimmel had just crossed a line that should never, ever be crossed. "What did you just say?" Beckham's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if he had screamed. He took a step toward Kimmel's desk, and for a moment everyone in the studio wondered if they were about to witness physical violence on live television. "What did you just say about my children?" Kimmel, finally seeming to realize the enormity of his mistake, tried to backtrack. "David, look, I was just—" But Beckham cut him off with a gesture that was as sharp and decisive as any of his legendary free kicks. "No, you don't get to explain that away." Beckham's British accent was now thick with rage, each word dropping like a hammer blow. "You just suggested that I'm a bad father. You implied that my children are only successful because of nepotism. You made fun of their dreams, their efforts, their dedication." He moved closer to the desk, and Kimmel actually took a step backward. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The host, visibly sweating now under the studio lights and the weight of his catastrophic error, tried one last desperate attempt at damage control. "David, this is live television. People say things—" "People say things?" Beckham's voice rose to a roar that echoed through every corner of the studio. "People say things? You attack my family, insult my parenting, mock my children's aspirations, and your defense is that people say things?" He slammed his hand down on Kimmel's desk with such force that the coffee mug sitting there jumped and spilled its contents across the surface. "You are absolutely disgusting." The audience was now completely silent except for a few audible gasps. Many were recording with their phones, sensing they were witnessing television history in the making. The show's producers could be seen frantically, gesturing from the wings, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage what had become an unmitigated disaster. Beckham straightened to his full height, his chest heaving with controlled fury. "I've spent my entire career dealing with people who wanted to tear me down, Jimmy. Opposing fans, bitter journalists, rival players who couldn't handle being beaten. But do you know what every single one of them had that you don't?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air like a sword. "Class, dignity, basic human decency." Kimmel tried one more pathetic attempt to regain control. "David, if we could just—" "No!" Beckham's shout reverberated through the studio like thunder. "You don't get to just anything. You invited me onto your show, and instead of conducting a professional interview, you decided to launch a personal attack on everything I hold dear. My career, my marriage, my family, my children." His voice dropped back to that deadly whisper. "You are not a comedian, Jimmy. You're not an entertainer. You're a bully with a platform, and you just picked on the wrong person." The camera caught every detail as Beckham began to remove his microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled despite the rage coursing through him. "You want to know what the difference is between me and you, Jimmy? When I step onto a pitch, I earn my respect through skill, dedication, and sportsmanship. When you step onto this stage, you try to earn laughs by destroying other people." He dropped the microphone onto Kimmel's desk with a decisive thud that seemed to punctuate the end of any possibility of salvaging this interview. "I'm done here, but let me leave you with one final thought, because I want to make sure everyone watching understands exactly what kind of person you really are." The entire studio leaned forward, sensing that whatever came next would be the moment that defined not just this confrontation, but potentially changed the landscape of late-night television forever. Beckham's final words came with the precision and power of one of his legendary free kicks, delivered with such controlled fury that they seemed to echo through the studio long after he spoke them. "You sit here every night, Jimmy, making jokes at other people's expense, thinking you're clever, thinking you're funny. But tonight, you've shown everyone exactly who you really are. You're a man so desperate for attention, so hungry for ratings, that you'll attack someone's children on live television." The camera captured every nuance of Beckham's expression as he continued his devastating final statement. "I've played in World Cups, Champions League finals, in front of crowds that wanted to destroy me, but I've never, not once, encountered someone with as little integrity as you've shown tonight. You've disrespected my family, my career, and most importantly, my children. That's not comedy, Jimmy. That's not entertainment. That's just cruelty." Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, his face pale, sweat visible on his forehead under the harsh studio lights. For once in his career, the man who made his living with words had absolutely nothing to say. The audience remained in stunned silence, many still recording what had become the most explosive talk show moment in television history. Beckham straightened his jacket with the same meticulous attention to detail he had once applied to lining up free kicks. "I came here tonight to talk about soccer, about growing the sport in America, about positive things. Instead, you turned this into a personal attack because you thought it would make for good television. Well, congratulations, Jimmy. You got your viral moment. But you also showed millions of people exactly what kind of person you are." He turned toward the audience, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "To everyone watching at home, I want you to know that this is not what entertainment should look like. This is not what happens when someone is truly confident in their craft. This is what happens when someone who has no real talent tries to build themselves up by tearing others down." The silence was broken only by the sound of Beckham's footsteps as he began walking toward the exit. But he wasn't finished. He stopped, turned back to face Kimmel one final time, and delivered the knockout blow that would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms. You know what the saddest part is, Jimmy? You could have had a great interview tonight. You could have asked about my foundation work, about developing young players, about the future of soccer in America. Instead, you chose to attack my family because you thought it would get you attention. Well, you got attention, all right, but not the kind you wanted. His voice dropped to that deadly whisper one final time. I genuinely feel sorry for you. With that, David Beckham turned and walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage with the same dignity and composure he had carried through every major moment of his career. The audience watched in absolute silence as one of the world's most beloved athletes disappeared through the exit, leaving behind a host who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The cameras continued rolling, capturing Kimmel's face, as the full magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. He stood there, mouth slightly open, staring at the empty guest chair where just minutes before he had thought he was conducting a routine celebrity interview. The studio audience began to murmur, then whisper, then talk outright about what they had just witnessed. Behind the scenes, show producers were already in crisis mode. The footage was too explosive, too newsworthy to contain. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were spreading across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and every other social media platform. The hashtag Beckham Kimmel began trending worldwide. Almost immediately, Kimmel finally seemed to remember he was still on live television. He looked directly into the camera, his usual confidence completely shattered. We're going to take a quick commercial break, he managed to say, his voice hoarse and uncertain. We'll be right back with... He paused, realizing he had no idea how to continue the show after what had just happened. We'll be right back. As the show cut to commercial, the damage was already done. Social media exploded with reactions, with the overwhelming majority supporting Beckham and condemning Kimmel's behavior. Within hours, major news outlets were picking up the story. Sports networks, entertainment shows, and even serious news programs were analyzing the confrontation. The aftermath was swift and brutal for Kimmel. Sponsors began pulling their support within days. Ratings plummeted as viewers expressed their disgust with the host's conduct. Industry insiders who had worked with Kimmel for years began speaking out about his behavior, with many saying they weren't surprised by what had happened. Meanwhile, Beckham's reputation only grew stronger. His dignified response to Kimmel's attacks, his defense of his family, and his graceful exit from an impossible situation earned him praise from fans, fellow athletes, and celebrities worldwide. He had shown that true class isn't about never getting angry. It's about how you conduct yourself when you have every right to be furious. The confrontation became a defining moment that changed how people viewed both men. Beckham emerged as a symbol of dignity under pressure, while Kimmel became a cautionary tale about the dangers of crossing lines that should never be crossed. The night that was supposed to be routine publicity became the night that showed the world the true character of both men involved. In the end, David Beckham didn't just walk off Jimmy Kimmel's show. He walked away as the clear winner in a confrontation that exposed the stark difference between genuine class and manufactured controversy.